Well, this is our third session together, and we've been working through our tactic called the Columbo tactic. You had a chance this last week to practice that a little bit, and I hope you had some good stories to share with your friends as we started this session a few moments ago. Let's take a moment right now as I begin the third session to kind of review what we covered last session. First, we examined the second use of the Columbo tactic, and we call that reversing the burden of proof. Now, the burden of proof is, of course, the responsibility that someone has for defending a point of view. And we talked about what the burden of proof rule was, and the rule was the person who makes the claim bears the burden. In other words, they need to make a defense for the points of view that they advance. We talked about another idea, and that was it wasn't enough to just give it an alternate explanation. An alternate explanation is not a refutation. People have to give reasons why their alternate explanation is a good one. They need evidence. We learned that the Columbo question that is meant to advance and reverse that burden of proof, and that second Columbo question was, now how did you come to that conclusion, or some variation of that. We also learned a little trick that might be played on you, a reversal of the burden of proof ploy that I call the professor's ploy. It's a common trap. I told you, don't get caught in that trap. Don't take the bait. When someone tries to reverse the burden of proof on you when you're not the one that's making the claim. Don't allow yourself to get into that defensive position. The third thing we learned is that you don't need to force the conversation. You know, you can get as far as you can using the information you know and let the Lord use what you've done. You don't have to hit home runs, I said. You don't even have to get on base. Just get up to bat, and you can use your Columbo questions to accomplish that. Just get in the game, basically. The fourth thing we did is we practiced the Columbo tactic in a very particular way. We taught you how to use it to get yourself out of the hot seat, that awful circumstance that you find yourself in where you finally venture out to share your faith, and all of a sudden you run into a critic who's much more informed than you are and very aggressive and dumps a bunch of information on you. We told you to use those two questions to stay in control but reverse the momentum. Get yourself out of the hot seat. You stop them, you say, gee, that's new information for me. Do you mind if you do this? Tell me what you believe. Tell me why you believe it, and then let me think about it. And that takes all the pressure off of you. Well, let me tell you what we're going to do today. We're going to examine the third use of the Columbo tactic, and that is to exploit a weakness or a flaw in another person's view. We're going to also learn some specific ways for you to learn how to improve your Columbo tactic, and I'm going to teach you how to defend against the Columbo tactic when somebody's using it against you in an abusive way. As I mentioned, the third way to use the Columbo tactic is to expose a weakness or a flaw in someone's point of view. And the information that you gather in your first two questions, what do you mean by that, and how did you come to that conclusion, is going to maybe alert you to something. It's going to put you in a better position to move to this final stage of Columbo by alerting you to a problem that this other person might have in their view. It might have tipped you off. So you use questions, once you find this flaw, to expose the weakness that they have in their view, and to subtly dismantle their point of view. That's basically the idea here. Notice that the first two questions are somewhat passive. You know, you don't have to know a lot to say, what do you mean by that, and how'd you come to that conclusion? This third question is more active. You actually have to know a few things. You have to have some information. You have to see something that's in their point of view, in their ideas that's amiss. You have to see a flaw or a contradiction in the other person's argument that you can then begin to work with. Now, there's no special formula for seeing this. You'll uncover it just by paying attention. You got to listen carefully. You've got to think about what has been said. You have to look, you have to observe, and you have to reflect. And when you do, when you pay close attention to what they're saying, especially to the second question and its answer, how did you come to that conclusion? And then they tell you how they came to that conclusion. You're going to have to ask yourself whether the reasons that they gave you for their point of view actually support the point of view that they have. Okay? If it doesn't, now you've got a problem. Now there's a flaw. You ask him whether his conclusions actually follow from the evidence, and then you work from there. Now, this is important because an argument is a very specific kind of thing. An argument is kind of like a house that has walls that support it. If you have a house with a roof and the walls are bad, the walls fall down, the house comes down. The house is only as good as the walls that support it. In the same way, an argument is like that house in that the roof is the point of view or the assertion, and the walls are like the reasons or the rationale that support that point of view. I mentioned earlier, some people they want to just give an assertion, but they need to also give the argument. They need more than a roof. In other words, they need the walls to support the roof. Your job here in this third step is to see if the walls of their point of view do the job. Does their argument support the point of view that they're promoting? Are there any blatant weaknesses in their view? Do their conclusions follow from the evidence? Is there a non sequitur of some sort, a misstep, a fallacy, some kind of failing? Now, if you find a failing, if you find a problem, the key here is not just to point it out. Oh, I know what's wrong with your view. Here it is. Rather, you use your questions to make your point rather than simply making a statement. Now, I realize that this third step of Columbo requires more practice than the others, but in time you'll improve. It requires some insight. It requires an ability to see the flaws in the argument. And some of you may not be able to see them right away, but that's okay. Don't get discouraged. Don't be frustrated. Don't be surprised at this. This is part of the growing process. With practice, you're going to get this. Just give it a little bit of time and give yourself some grace. Let me give you an example of the kind of thing that I'm talking about here. I read this in a book called Icons of Evolution, which is a very excellent book on dealing with the issue of evolution, written by Jonathan Wells. And in that, there's a dialogue between a teacher and a student that he offers that is a great example of the student, in a very gentle way, using the third use of the Columbo tactic to address something the teacher had said about evolution. The issue here is homology, the idea that in the process of evolutionary development, that subsequent generations of creatures have very similar physical organs and physical structures to the ones that come before it. And here's what he says. The teacher starts out, okay, let's start today's lesson with a quick review. Yesterday I talked about homology, how different organisms show remarkable similarity in the structure of some of their body parts. Homologous features, such as the vertebrate limbs shown in your textbook, provide us with some of the best evidence that living things have evolved from common ancestors. The student then raises his hand. Now, I know you went over this yesterday, Professor, but I'm still a little confused. How do we know whether a feature is homologous or not? Teacher says, well, if you look at vertebrate limbs, you can see that even though they're adapted to perform different functions, their bone patterns are structurally similar. But you told us yesterday that even though an octopus eye is structurally similar to a human eye, the two are not homologous. Yeah, that's right. Octopus and human eyes are not homologous because we know their common ancestor did not have such an eye. So regardless of similarity, features are not homologous unless they're inherited from a common ancestor? Yeah, now you're catching on. Well, actually, I'm still confused. You say homologous features provide some of the best evidence for common ancestry, but before we can tell whether features are homologous, we have to know whether they came from a common ancestor or not. That's right. Well, I must be missing something. See, you can see the Columbo going on. I don't know. Where's my cigar, I must be missing something. It sounds as though you're saying that we know features are derived from a common ancestor because they're derived from a common ancestor. Isn't that circular reasoning? That's a great example of the kind of thing that we're talking about here in using those questions once you see a problem to exploit the problem. Now, I want you to work on this just a little bit with an interactive exercise. You'll find it on page 45 of your workbook. In groups of 4 or 5, I want you to take 7 or 8 minutes to work through some of the problems that you found there. Go ahead and take care of that right now. Okay, let's see how we might respond to some of those challenges that you dealt with in your exercise. I'm going to, in dealing with some of these challenges, I'm going to try to include a little bit of the backstory. In other words, I won't just give you the question that I would ask, but I'm going to try to explain very briefly why I'm using the question that I'm using, why there's something wrong with this idea, and I'm using this particular question to begin to exploit it. Now, not all of you are going to follow the details of the backstory. It's too brief. But if you go to your workbook, you'll find a lot more information there on each of the things that I'll be talking about. So when somebody says, you shouldn't push your morality on me, in employing the third use of the Columbo tactic, I ask this question: why not? Now the ball's in their court. They've got to answer. And what are they going to say? They can't very well say, because it's wrong. Because that would be an example of them doing what to me? Pushing their morality on me. When somebody says, you're intolerant, you're arrogant, I always have a question to ask them. First, I use one of the information gathering question. What do you mean by that? I want to know exactly why they're calling me intolerant or arrogant. And they almost always answer the same way. Well, you think you're right. You think your point of view is correct and everybody else is wrong. To which I respond, yes, I do. Now, I'm not making it up. I've got an argument, but, I could be mistaken, but I don't think that I am. But let me ask you a question. And now I'm setting up a series of questions to reveal what I call the passive-aggressive tolerance trick. Happens almost every time somebody challenges you for being intolerant. You always ask the first question, what do you mean by that? When you discover the answer that I just gave you, you think you're right. Then the next question is this. You're right, I do, but let me ask you a question. The beliefs that you have, different from mine, do you think your beliefs are right or wrong? Now, what are they going to say? I mean, yeah, I have all these beliefs and they're totally wrong? No, people believe things because they think they're right. So now I have another question. Why is it when I think I'm right, I'm intolerant? But when you think you're right, you're just right. What am I missing here? Now, this is not a rhetorical question. I want an answer from that person because basically this is just simple name calling, okay? This doesn't help our conversation at all, and my series of questions is meant to flush that out. What about if somebody says the Bible is just a bunch of myths and fables, like the professor in the illustration in the last session? My question is, how did you come to that conclusion? Professor might say, well, because there are miracles in the Bible. My question, yes, and what would be the problem with that? Well, miracles can't happen. And how did you come to that conclusion? Notice how when he makes a claim, I continue to press him on it, but in a very cordial way. How did you come to that conclusion? Because science has proven that miracles can't happen. Now I've got him. Because I know that science has not proved any such thing. Science is not capable of proving miracles can't happen. It might disprove a given claim to a miracle, but it can't disprove miracles in principle, because science isn't meant to measure the supernatural. It is only meant to measure the natural. And so my final question to him is, Professor, could you please explain to me precisely how it is that science has proven that miracles can't happen even in principle? Now, he's not going to be able to do that. And what I've uncovered here is the real problem. It's not his commitment to science as a system of knowledge. It's his commitment to a certain philosophy, naturalism, which holds that there are no miracles that are possible. Once in Time magazine, I saw a similar kind of problem here. In 1995, there was an issue of Time magazine completely devoted to the question of the soul. And they came to the conclusion that there was no soul. I mean, they talked to all these scientists, and this was their conclusion. And they told you why. And here's what they said. And I'm not making this up. This is almost an exact quote. They said, we don't know what consciousness is, but one thing we know it's not. There is no you inside there that's making things happen. There is no soul. The lights are on, but nobody's home, kind of thing. What's their reasons? Scientists have been looking for it for 100 years, souls, and they haven't been able to find it. First reason. Secondly, there is no conceivable place in the brain for such a soul to fit. I'm not making this up. Now, do you see that this is a category error? They're asking the wrong kind of questions about souls. If there is a soul, it's immaterial. It doesn't need any place in the brain to fit. That's like saying, you told me there was an invisible man in your house. Well, I went back into the house there and I looked all around and I didn't see him. I mean, I looked in the bathroom and in the closet and under the bed. I didn't see him anywhere. Well, that doesn't prove that an invisible man exists, but it certainly doesn't disprove that he exists. It's the wrong way to look at it. And this is the same mistake that this professor has made, and my questions then are just meant to exploit that. Say somebody says, Jesus was just a good man, a prophet, but he wasn't God, he wasn't the only Savior. Listen, how could Jesus be a good man and a prophet, but be mistaken about his essential nature, his essential character, his identity, and his purpose? I mean, Jesus did not leave that option open to us. If he was wrong about his point of view, he wasn't a good man. He wasn't a good prophet. He was an idiot or a liar or worse. You've probably heard of the Lord, liar, lunatic. That's where this comes in. The ancient way of putting it was aut deus, aut homo malus, either God or a bad man. Those are the options open to us, not an option that Jesus is a good man, but he is not the person he claimed to be. Notice how I found the flaw, and then I used a question to exploit that flaw. When they say a fetus may be a human being, but it's not a person, my question is, what's the difference? Now, here's why that question's important. Ball's back in their court, right? The question's important because they basically said that there are two categories of human beings: human persons and human non-persons. Human persons must be protected by law, but human non-persons you can kill at will. Now, if there are these distinctions between these two groups, we better be really clear on what the dividing line happens to be, right? That's something that they should have thought about, and that's why I asked the question, what's the difference? The answer, by the way, is there is no difference. Humans are persons by nature. Some people raise a question about the problem of evil. How could God exist when there's so much evil in the world? My question to them is, listen, if there is no God, how can we call anything evil? How can we call anything good? You see, to call something evil, you have to have some kind of standard of goodness that is absolute and objective. When things deviate from that standard, we call that evil. So by identifying something as evil, we are also implicitly acknowledging that some absolute standard of good exists. And my question is, where did that scoring system come from? It's going to be very, very difficult to account for an objective external standard of good from which evil is a departure without having a God to ground that kind of thing. So the problem here is, how can we make sense of the difference between good and evil if there is no God? I exploit that problem by asking a question and putting it back into their court. Now, you can soften these exchanges a little bit, the third use of Columbo, by couching your question as a request for clarification. You can say, as Columbo did, can you clear this up for me? Let me give you a couple of examples of how this could work out. Some people think that reincarnation was in the Bible and then it was taken out, okay? Of course, I always want to ask the question, how did you come to that conclusion? But I think there's a problem with that view. And so here's a kind of a gentle way of questioning in the third Columbo way that shows the problem. Can you clear this up for me? How can the teaching on reincarnation be removed from every existing handwritten copy of the New Testament that's circulating in the Roman world by the 4th century? You see the problem there, okay? Can you help me understand this? If the Bible were really just written by men, how can it have fulfilled prophecy? Help me understand this for a moment. If homosexuality is really natural, as you're suggesting, why did nature give homosexuals bodies designed for reproductive sex with women and not men? Why would nature give desires for one type of sex, but the body for another type of sex? Here's another one. Can you clear this up for me? If partial birth abortion is morally acceptable, on what grounds do we condemn infanticide? Because the only difference between the two is the baby's location, partially out of the womb or completely out of the womb. And it just seems that location is morally irrelevant to the baby's value. Can you help me understand that? Maybe you can help me understand this, and I'm very confused about this. Look, if there's no evidence for life coming from non-life, which is part of the evolutionary program, and there's a lot of evidence against it, and this is the actual kickoff of the whole evolutionary enterprise, how can you say that evolution is a fact when you can't even get it off the ground? Am I missing something here? You see, sometimes the best way to address an issue is not to take it head on. It's to kind of come from the side, scratch your head, shuffle your feet, rub the back of your neck, play the Columbo bit a little bit, ask for clarification, use an indirect approach, ask for some help. And then, once you hear what they have to say, you might just offer an alternative idea and ask them to respond to it. It's very, very simple. Now, this approach, I think, shows a lot of respect for the person that you disagree with. Once you understand her viewpoint, you can simply ask, do you mind if I ask a couple of questions? I mean, you've told me some things that are curious, but I'm not sure I understand them entirely, and I have some concerns. Or would you consider an alternative to the view that you've just offered? Or would you be willing to look at another angle, and then you can move in with your new idea? See how that's so much softer than banging heads with people? That's what you're looking for. Because by soliciting permission to disagree, you make the entire encounter much more amicable, more friendly, and you also stay where? In the driver's seat, which is where you want to be. Remember, the person who asked the questions, what? Controls the conversations. Okay, it's time for an interactive here, and I'd like you to do a quick exercise. It's really simply a review by way of recall. Now, without looking at your notes, I want you to recall the main idea of each Columbo question, and I want you to write them in the space in your notes that's provided on page 49. So you recall it, write it down, and then when you're done, I want you to pair up and explain the basics of these ideas as if you're explaining them to this other person for the very, very first time. Take about 5 minutes to do that. Go ahead. Okay, maybe you've got a question at this point. What happens if you get to the third step of Columbo and you're just not sure where to go next? I mean, this third step requires that you have some kind of insight, right, into a flaw or a difficulty or a problem in the other person's point of view. But what if you don't see the problem? What if you don't have the resources to go further? What if you're kind of stumped? Worse, what if you think the other person's just losing interest in your conversation? Well, here's my recommendation. It's very simple. Don't sweat it. Don't feel compelled to force the conversation. We've talked about this before. Just let the encounter die a natural death. Consider it a fruitful, productive learning experience. Maybe in the conversation, the person has gained something. You've put a stone in their shoe. You've got them thinking about something. That's okay. Again, you don't have to hit home runs. Which brings me to another point, and I realize that this is a little bit controversial, but in my view, I don't think you have to get to the foot of the cross at every single encounter with other people. You don't have to close every deal. I mean, some people are good closers. I mean, they go into a situation, they share the simple gospel, they bump up against the fruit, and it falls into the basket, and they say, well, that was easy. You don't need all this apologetics. You don't need all these courses and all this fancy stuff, reading all these books. I just share the simple gospel. And boy, look at people respond. And what they don't realize is probably in the case where that person responded to the simple gospel, that same person had been exposed to a whole bunch of ambassadors down the line like you, that were giving a little here and there, planting, seeding, watering, moving that plant along until it came to the point of being ready for harvest, and then it just dropped into the basket, and the person who harvested thought it was a real simple issue. Frankly, I think that most people are not harvesters. I'll tell you something, I'm not a harvester. I'm one of those planters and waterers. I'm just that guy that kind of moves the thing along. I don't lead that many people to Christ personally. I let somebody else do that. And I suspect that most of you are not harvesters either. And you feel badly about that, and so you never get into the field at all. Look, we are different members of the same body. We have different roles. We have a unique job to play, each one of us. And the fact is, by the way, most people need some time to think about the things that you've just said to them. I don't want people to come to the cross too quickly. Because if they come to the cross quickly, they may leave just as quickly. This is a big decision. This is a decision that I want to see transform their entire lives. I want them to be very well informed when they come to Christ, when they make that decision, exactly what's entailed. They need some time to think about it. So my goal is rather modest. I mentioned it just a moment ago. My goal is not to lead people to Christ. My goal is to just put a stone in their shoe. I want to give them something worth thinking about. I want them to leave a session that I might have hobbling out kind of on something I've said, being annoyed in a good way, thinking about the important things that we've just discussed. All right, let's talk for a moment about improving our Columbo skill. There are actually 3 steps to this. Here they are: anticipate, reflect, and practice. Anticipate, reflect, and practice. Now, let's face it, initially you are not going to be fast on your feet, given the kind of responses that I just offered you in our exercise a few moments ago. But I'll tell you what, I didn't think of those things in the spur of the moment either. I'm not fast on my feet. I use some of these techniques to improve my Columbo skill, to have these things now in my toolbox, and you can do the same. You're going to find out, by the way, when you're talking, that it's hard to think of things in the heat of the moment. The time when it's easiest to think of the good answers and responses is when the pressure's off. Now, what are the 2 times the pressure is off in a conversation? Before it starts and after it's over, right? So you want to use those 2 times to prepare so you have the goods when the time comes. In other words, first, you want to try to anticipate objections and think of questions in advance. You might just think about an issue that has stumped you in the past and people have brought it up and you're not sure what to do. Okay, sit down and think about it. Prepare in advance. Brainstorm some straightforward response questions that will help put you in the driver's seat of those conversations. Just plan ahead is the idea, okay? Remember, a question mark is shaped like a fish hook upside down. And that reminds me that your questions ought to be like a hook. Okay, to draw people in. Now, this advanced preparation may take a little bit of work. You got to think ahead, but it can be very, very effective because the next time you're asked those particular questions, you'll have the responses right there at your fingertips. Second, so first, plan in advance. Second, after each encounter, take a few moments for self-assessment. I mean, you can reflect then on what you might have said if you just had your wits about you a little bit more. The thing's all over with, you can look back. And I do this all the time. Remember that witch in Wisconsin? You know, when I walked, we were done. And I thought, gee, I wish I could have said more. And as my wife and I were walking out of the grocery store, she was closing up shop. We waved at her, and she said, "Have a nice day." And I got back to the car, and I was thinking about that, and I said, "Have a nice day." That was kind of odd. And why was that odd? Because she just said that it was okay to kill babies, and then told me to have a nice day. Now, what if I had gone up to her and said, "You know, this is odd, what you said there, in light of our discussion." What if I said that I thought it was really good for people to burn witches? Have a nice day. You see, now, I mean, that wasn't a knockdown, drag-out kind of response, but it was just my way of thinking through the circumstances and trying to figure out how could I have responded? How could I have phrased the questions more effectively? How could I have maneuvered through the conversation differently? And when the pressure's off, there's other alternatives that are going to occur. Take the time to think about those things and write those things down. When I left that conversation with the witch in Wisconsin, I sat down in the car and I wrote out that conversation. So I had it, and I got it right. Now, this kind of assessment is not that hard, and it can be a lot of fun, partly because it prepares you for the next opportunity. It puts new ideas right there at your fingertips for the next time around, and your responses then, when you practice, will become almost second nature because you've already practiced it, right? You've gotten used to these ideas. Incidentally, this is the way that politicians get ready for political debates. You know, they go back and forth. They plan the questions in advance. They think about what they'll be asked, and then they think about their responses. And this is the third step, really. When you think of a new idea or a new response or some way you might have responded, don't just write it down. Actually practice it. Go through the motions. Role play it. I come back from the radio show, the enforcer is sitting next to me in the car, and we're talking about things, and I'm coming up with other responses, and I'm role-playing it with her, essentially. And sometimes she'll come back to me with a rejoinder that is a response, the kind of thing the other person might have said. That's good to keep in mind. Think for yourself, well, if I said this, what would they say in response? Gee, if they said that in response, I could say this, and then you practice it. And see, now you're in the groove. You're anticipating the turns, the new tack that your conversation might take, and then how you'd respond to it. You're role-playing it, so now it's becoming familiar with you. This is why we've been doing these exercises here. They've been a little bit contrived, but at least you're getting into the habit of working with these concepts a little bit. And if you practice in advance, when these issues come up, you'll be ready. Now, this really works. You'll have a response. I've done this a lot myself. It's not enough to prepare, by the way. You also have to engage. Interacting with other people is going to be the way that's going to help you to learn this the best. So practice, anticipate, reflect, practice, then put it into practice, engaging other people. Now what I'd like you to do is turn to the Think, Pair, Share interactive exercise that's on page 52 of your workbooks, and I want you to follow the instructions that you find there. Go ahead and do that now. Okay, now I want to talk about something that may seem a little weird at first. We're teaching you the Columbo tactic. It may turn out, though, that you run into somebody else who knows the tactic too. Now, maybe they're just asking questions to get information, and that's fine. But you also may sense that they're asking questions to lead you down the primrose path. They're setting you up, and they're going to nail you, and you don't know where they're taking you. They're going to use the third aspect of the Columbo tactic to get you. How can you protect yourself against that kind of person? It's very easy. 2 simple steps, all right? First, you got to stop the advance. In other words, he's asking you questions, and you're supposed to be answering, and you realize, I don't want to be going there. Just stop. Don't let the other guy set you up with leading questions. You don't have to be mean about this or nasty. Just don't respond to him. Instead, simply say, "I'd rather not answer questions right now. I want to know what you think." So, how about this? And this is the second point: regain control by using the Columbo tactic, particularly your first 2 questions. Remember how you use those to stay out of the hot seat? It's basically the same thing here. You tell the person, I don't want to answer your questions right now. Frankly, instead of doing that, why don't you just tell me what you believe and tell me why you believe it, and then I'll think about it. Just state your point clearly so I don't misunderstand it. Columbo question 1. Tell me your reasons for it. Columbo question 2. And let me think about it. Now you're out of the hot seat of the Columbo guy who's trying to use the Columbo tactic against you. Now, if you see a problem after he stated things, you can move to Columbo number 3. And by the way, some people have asked me, well, what happens when people do that to you? When they won't let you use the Columbo tactic on them? Listen, the point of the Columbo tactic is to communicate the point of view that I have in a little bit more subtle way. Okay, to make my point by using questions. If somebody doesn't want me to make my point using questions, you know what I'll do? I'll just make my point straight up. If they said to me, well, instead of, giving me 30 questions, why don't you just tell me what you believe and why you believe it? You know what I'll do? I'll tell them. That's fine with me. I have lost, I think, a little bit of a tactical advantage, but I don't feel ill-abused because of that. That's fine. Okay, let's do a quick final interactive for this session. You'll find it on page 53, okay? I want you to get in pairs and take turns explaining to each other, first, the 3 steps to improving your skill at Columbo, and second, the 2 steps in defending against Columbo. Take about 4 minutes for that. Okay, what main points did we cover in this session? First, we looked at the third use of Columbo, and that is exploiting a weakness or a flaw that we find in somebody else's point of view. I said to listen carefully to the reasons, especially the answer to the question, how did you come to that conclusion? And ask yourself if the conclusions follow from the premises. Given the idea that an argument is like a house with a point of view, that's the roof, and the walls that support it, do the walls support the roof in this case? Do the conclusions follow from the evidence? And if not, then point out your errors with questions rather than with statements. Second thing we learned was 3 specific ways to improve your Columbo skill. I said to anticipate, I said to reflect, and I said to practice. In other words, anticipate objections in advance and get a leg up on the process. After you're done, reflect on questions you might have asked, and then when you come up with these things in both cases, give some time to practicing it a little bit, role-playing it before you get out with other people. The third thing that we learned was how to defend against the Columbo tactic when it's used against you. First, stop the person who's asking you the questions. Tell them, you just rather not answer a bunch of questions. Second, you want to regain control by you asking the question, why don't you just tell me what you believe and why you believe it, and then I'll give it some consideration. Now, in the next session, we're going to learn a very powerful new tactic called the suicide tactic. All right? But there's a couple of things that I'd like you to do between now and the next time we get together. This week, I want you to look for opportunities, okay, to use your newly acquired Columbo skills. I want you to use the first 2 questions. What do you mean by that? And how did you come to that conclusion? To navigate in conversations. And if you feel comfortable, use more questions to gently challenge a point of view that you think you found a flaw in. Now, if you're stumped, just let the issue go. Maybe brainstorm afterwards some ways that you might have responded to, talk to some friends or something about that. But give it a try. And then when you come back next time, be ready to kind of share a few of your stories with some of the people in the group when we return for the next session. I'll see you then.